The Just Lead Advancing Racial Equity Conference, hosted by New Detroit, brought together national and local speakers who provided compelling insights into racial equity and justice. Khary Fraiser, Detroit is Different, provides you conversations with some of the phenomenal guests, talking dismantling racism with collaborative solutions.
I'm Gordon Krater, a retired partner at Plante Moran, at the Just Lead Conference, which has been an excellent conference.
Khary Fraiser with Detroit is Different here at the Just Lead 2023 conference, and we're talking racial equity with Gordon Krater of Plante Moran. How are you today?
Great, Khary. How are you?
Oh man, everything is fair. Everything is fair. So you were in a discussion with Dewan Dandridge,
yes,
and also facilitated by Frida Sampson. Great friends of Detroit is Different, and just sharing some of the resources of how you've empowered yourself, and they were sharing resources of how they've empowered others and themselves about racial equity and why it's so important. How do you vet the resources, the books, the speakers, even the videos, or maybe even just the handouts of information to empower yourself to get better understandings of racial equity?
Khary, I think there's lots of great resources out there, and it's reaching out. What's worked for other people? How have people responded to that? And I think those are all really important. What you don't want to do is sheep dip people into some program, and everybody goes through the same thing, and they come out with a little better understanding, but no follow up from there. It can't be a program of the month kind of a thing. So I think much more powerful is the cross-cultural relationships that is important. I think that's where the learning has come, especially for me, where I actually look you in the eye, understand who you are, what your story is, why you feel the way you feel. You can inform me on things that I just wasn't exposed to or didn't know or what have you. Again, I think a lot of the problem with racism, and there's plenty of sins of commission, but there's a lot of sins of omission, and so that we just don't know in many cases. And so let's get to know each other. Let's build trust. Let's build understanding. Let's cut through a lot of the noise that's out there on what groups tell me I ought to think about you or you ought to think about me. I'd rather make my own judgment and look you in the eye. And I'm a firm believer when you're talking to somebody and another human being, it doesn't matter race, sexual orientation, anything else. If you are with them, looking in the eye, you can't hate them.
And it's unique. You go to relationships and that personal relationship, as I would say that even at times we can even question American culture itself being so individualistic. And this is breakdowns beyond whatever group we want to identify with. It can even become in the family itself. So how have you kept your eyes open? How have you widened your lens in understanding to build those relationships when just the day-to-day can just be tough here of what's next for you and not necessarily identifying and having empathy for others?
Yeah, Khary, you make a great point. And I heard a saying once, this has to be a Monday morning item, not a Friday afternoon item. So not a if I get to it, but this has to be kind of front and center, DE&I and the relationships, cross-cultural relationships that we have. So I think getting out of your comfort zone is a big part of it. Again, I think as a white male, there's times when I'm just afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing, and then people think less of me or think I'm a racist, whatever it is. And I've kind of gotten past that and just said, here's who I am. Let's create a safe space. Let's be able to have conversations and gain understanding. Again, because even if we don't agree on something, if I at least understand where you're coming from and you understand where I'm coming from, and I'm not talking about race, but an issue, let's say, at least we can respect that and agree to move on. And it's not they think that because, or he thinks that because, or whatever it is. And again, there's plenty of news stations out there and others that are fomenting the way we ought to think, as opposed to sitting down, making the time, take the time with people. And by the way, it'll always be a richer experience. Can I tell you a story?
Yeah, please share.
So I was being treated for something, a health issue in Ann Arbor. So I was at University Hospital, and I was in the parking lot. I was dressed in a suit and tie, and going in, and I saw this older gentleman, elderly black gentleman. He had a Tuskegee Airmen coat on. And I said, you know, are you Tuskegee Airmen? And he gives me the, what do you know about Tuskegee Airmen? I said, I've read a lot. I mean, it's very interesting to me you know, the highs and lows of what a group's gone through and who was in the group. And he says, yeah, I was. And so we had this rich conversation, and he says, are you a doctor? I said, no, I'm here. I had cancer. And he said, yeah, I do too. They told me I had 14 days to live. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry. He says, well, that was 8 years ago. You know, and he laughs. And him telling me about that and about other branches of the military, he actually had a book he gave me. He went back to his car and gave me this book on Tuskegee Airmen. And I just thought, those are the kinds of things that you just have to step out of your comfort zone, and he has to be comfortable because, I mean, we're all people. That's all we are. I mean, we're all people. And it's just learn to have conversations and understanding, and I think you're much richer, let alone the business case, as you mentioned earlier. The business case for diversity is incredible. And so I could spend a lot of time on that, but it's really how you get there is the important thing.
Last question. What initiatives at Plante Moran do you applaud and have you been a part of that have boosted the racial equity of the organization?
Khary, that's a great question. And you know, we've tried a lot of things. Some have worked, some haven't. But you know, part of what I've tried to do is reach down. There were a couple people that I could see a lot of promise in. They were very young. Let's get together. There were 2 African American women, and they had, we'll have safe space and have discussions. You can tell me how you're feeling, what's going on, what are your barriers. I'll tell you why we're doing what we're doing and how I can eliminate barriers. And they're both partners in our firm now. Wow. Very successful partners in our firm. And so, I mean, things like that. And some of the things that came from discussion with them is they said, you know what? One of the things we found is a lot of us didn't grow up in families where there was a lot of business. And so we could probably have a booster session for people of color coming in saying, you know, before they even start, here are some things, you know, like that you may not have learned at home, but let's have a discussion about that now. And so people could hit the ground running rather than hit the ground feeling like they're starting behind, not from an education standpoint, but maybe from an experience standpoint. And that's many other things that were helpful that we implemented. We have, you know, the usual DEI groups, and our affinity groups are particularly helpful, I think. We call them staff resource groups, and African American, neurodiversity, you know, all kinds of issues where people feel comfortable having a discussion. We gave them budget, have discussions, bring me in when you need me in there, and so that's been, I think, rich. Pride would be another of the groups, and so I think trying to look at it and not have it just be somebody that says it again. This is flavor of the month. You know, I'm going to react to the George Floyd situation that was discussed earlier today, and promise to, you know, put some budget towards something or do some things. Knee-jerk reactions don't work. It's long-term systemic approaches that I think are what works in this area.
That's deep, and I know I said last question, but that definitely leads to a question I've been asking everyone today, and it just drove me right up there, and I was like, okay, I'm probably not going to ask them this question. But as we think of that training, as you say, like, okay, you may not have got this in your household, where does the table reverse to? Because there is a culture, an understanding, a community that exists, especially when we think of Detroit, where what I label as traditional Americana may not necessarily see those values, but our community is abundantly applauding those values. Where do organizations learn the ethics, the values, the opportunities, the economics, and the education of our community?
Khary, that's a great question, and I think it goes back to, there are a number of things you can do that are more formal, but again, to me, the best form is cross-cultural relationships, making sure that you have settings where you can have discussions, reach out to people, understand. Because again, to me, it's not, I don't have any ill intent. Mine would be lack of knowledge. And so bring me up to speed on the rich culture. What books can I read to be helpful in that regard? What sessions can I go to like this today, you know, the Just Lead conference? Or what else can I do that really would be impactful? We did have a racial healing project that Plante Moran sponsored through New Detroit, and it was deep. It was emotional. You know, we had everything from genealogy to ancestry to history to, you know, it was a series that went. And at the end of it, and I came from relatively modest upbringing. My grandparents came over from Poland. My grandmother was an indentured servant for 7 years to pay her passage. You know, my dad didn't speak English till he was 6, was discriminated against, said we'll never be discriminators because I know what it's like. I can change the way I speak. Some people can't change their skin color, and by the way, shouldn't want to and shouldn't have to. And so I grew up in a household that was very open and accommodating. And so, you know, but even with that, you know, I felt guilt, you know, at the end of the session. I'm like, why do I feel guilt? And, you know, my family didn't participate in that. It took me a while to realize, you know what, but people that look like me did.
Yeah.
And I had advantages that some other people didn't have because of my skin color or where I grew up. And, you know, so I said, I'm going to take that from guilt to responsibility to commitment, and commitment to stamp out racism. And so I'm a work in process. I'm constantly trying to learn and get better and understand. You know, again, I didn't grow up, maybe I grew up in a different slice of Americana, but you know, I hear people say, you know, hide behind things like patriotism or, you know, I'm a patriot. It's like, you know, what is it you really are? I mean, well, I love this country. I said, well, you know what I love more than America? I love Americans. And all Americans. And that's what, let me understand and meet them where they are.